Hi, I'm Leonor, and today I'm going to travel across centuries to tell you the story of South Africa, a place where empires, trade, resistance, and hope decided to share the same piece of land.
Long before any European map decided to sketch this country into existence, African peoples had already been living at the southern tip of the continent for thousands of years. Communities had learned how to live with the land, the climate, and the animals long before any explorer arrived claiming to have discovered something. The Khoisan, known for their deep relationship with nature, understood every wind shift and every trail across the land with a precision few European navigators could ever match. Centuries later, Bantu-speaking peoples began settling in different parts of the region. They brought agriculture, metalworking, and trade networks that connected communities across the continent. Southern Africa already had its own history, culture, and economy, long before any foreign flag appeared on the horizon. For a long time, the region remained outside European sea routes, until Portuguese navigators started searching for a maritime path to the riches of Asia. In 1488, Portuguese navigator Bartolomeu Dias reached the southern tip of Africa. After battling violent storms, he sailed around what later became known as the Cape of Good Hope, an optimistic name for a place that nearly destroyed his fleet. For Europeans, the route meant direct access to Asian trade. For the communities already living there, it meant something slightly different: new visitors, new exchanges, and new interests that would only grow with time. For more than a century, European ships mostly stopped in the region just to refill water and gather supplies. It was a convenient stop between Europe and Asia. But history has a habit of showing that convenient stops sometimes become permanent ones. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company decided to organize that stop a bit more formally, creating a supply station at the Cape of Good Hope. Yes, in practical terms, it was the beginning of a colony. European settlers gradually began establishing themselves in the region. Dutch farmers, later known as Boers, expanded their farms deeper into the interior, a process that inevitably created tensions with communities that had lived there for generations. As European settlement moved inland, many colonists also sought independence from colonial authorities. Some Boer families literally packed their wagons, children, and livestock, and headed into the continent searching for autonomy. This movement became known as the Great Trek, beginning in the 1830s. Hundreds of families left the Cape Colony and traveled thousands of kilometers in ox-drawn wagons. It was an unusual mix of searching for freedom, hoping for new land, and carrying a healthy amount of courage. Along the way, these groups founded small, independent republics in the interior, including the Orange Free State and the South African Republic of Transvaal. But the interior of South Africa was far from empty. Organized societies already lived there, with defined territories and their own political structures. As often happens in stories of territorial expansion, encounters between different societies were not always peaceful. Throughout the 19th century, disputes over land, trade, and influence became increasingly common as African kingdoms, local communities, and European settlers competed for power in a landscape growing more complex by the year. Then, something happened that tends to change any region remarkably fast. Extremely valuable natural resources were discovered. In 1867, diamonds were found in the region of Kimberley. News of the discovery spread across the world almost immediately. Within a short time, thousands of people arrived, hoping to become rich overnight. Entire towns appeared almost out of nowhere, and what had once been a quiet area quickly transformed into a booming global economic center. A few years later, an even bigger discovery followed: gold in the Witwatersrand region. Suddenly, South Africa became one of the most desired places on the planet for investors, fortune seekers, and of course, imperial powers interested in control. Economic growth intensified political tensions between the British Empire and the Boer republics. Both sides wanted influence over mineral-rich territories, and as history often shows, that competition eventually turned into armed conflict. By the end of the 19th century, those tensions exploded into the Boer Wars, conflicts between the British Empire and the Boer settlers. The wars, driven by territory, resources, and power, left deep marks on the region's history. In the early 20th century, after years of fighting and negotiations, the former Boer republics and British colonies were unified. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was created under British rule. The new government began organizing the country under political structures inspired by European models. However, access to political power was far from equal. Some voices participated in national decisions, while many others were carefully kept at a distance. In 1913, the Natives' Land Act was passed, restricting where much of the population could live and own land. For some, it seemed like an administrative decision. For many others, it reshaped the social balance entirely. Over time, these policies gradually built a highly structured system of social and territorial separation. The country's economy continued to grow, especially through mining and agriculture, but opportunities were not shared equally. In 1948, a new government came to power, determined to formalize and expand that system. This was the moment when apartheid emerged, a word that literally means separation, though in practice it represented far more than that. Apartheid introduced laws regulating where people could live, work, or study. The system was complex, bureaucratic, and carefully structured, an impressive example of how political decisions can reshape the lives of millions. Naturally, many people refused to accept it quietly. Social movements, political leaders, and organizations began challenging those policies. Among them was the African National Congress, which called for deep and fundamental change in the country. For decades, demonstrations, political campaigns, and protests tried to dismantle the system. Many of these movements faced strong repression from the state. Even so, resistance continued to grow both inside and outside South Africa. One of the most recognizable figures of that struggle was Nelson Mandela. A lawyer and political activist, he became one of the most powerful voices against apartheid, and, unsurprisingly, spent many years in prison because of it. Even with leaders imprisoned and movements restricted, debate about the country's future kept growing. At the same time, international pressure increased, as governments and organizations openly criticized South Africa's political system. By the late 1980s, the situation was impossible to ignore. Internal protests were intensifying, and international sanctions were damaging the economy. The country faced an unavoidable question: maintain the system or finally change direction. In 1990, something happened that had long seemed unlikely. Nelson Mandela was released after 27 years in prison. His release marked the beginning of negotiations that only a few years earlier many believed were simply impossible. Talks between government officials and political leaders began reshaping the country's future. The process was neither simple nor fast. Undoing decades of laws, institutions, and distrust requires something rare in politics: patience. During those transitional years, South Africa experienced tension, intense debates, and plenty of uncertainty. Even so, the country slowly moved toward a new political model based on democratic participation. In 1994, the first national elections with broad participation finally took place. Millions of people voted for the first time in their lives. Long lines formed outside polling stations, an historic moment that captured the attention of the entire world. Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa. His victory marked the beginning of a new chapter in the country's history, when politics finally started reflecting the diversity of its own society. Since then, South Africa has continued to face social, economic, and political challenges. Yet its story also reveals something interesting about history. Some systems appear permanent, right up until the day they suddenly are not.
As I moved through this history, I saw an entire country learn that time can eventually bring down even the most rigid systems. Aha still holds many curious and surprising stories. If you'd like to keep traveling through time with me, stay right here.